We have these theories on reality, all of us, right? We have a specific theory, and based on our theory, based on our identity, we're always going to find evidence to support our identity and support our theory. So if I don't like what I'm seeing, it means that the theory or the identity that I have about myself is not serving me. And so I became a student of my thoughts and a student of my energy. So the moment my external world does not show up in ways that I'm, let's say, in alignment with, I don't go to the outside world to change it. I go back to my inner world.
Hey everybody, it's Christine Marie Mason, your host for the Rose Woman podcast. How are you doing out there? I am doing really great. I came from San Francisco to London, and I travel a lot, I traverse a lot of time zones, and that's not always easy, but I've developed a couple of little hacks that make it go down. When I land in a new place, I touch the ground. I say to myself, you're now in London, you're now in London. I do a little energetic hygiene, shaking, breathing, and then I drop my luggage wherever I'm going, and I find a place where I can really sweat it out. And sometimes that's hot yoga. Like yesterday, after I landed, I left San Francisco at 8 p.m., sat in a chair most of the night, not that big of a challenge, but you get kind of creaky and uncomfortable. Landed at 2, dropped my stuff off, and then went to Fierce Grace, which is a sweaty, stinky studio, but very excellent instruction, packed to the gills in North London. And after I came out of there, I felt clean in a way that you don't get from a shower, like you've washed yourself from the inside out. That similar feeling is sometimes achievable by dropping into a jjimjilbang, a Korean spa, or a Russian banya, or a hammam, depending on where you're going. Like sometimes it's straight from the airport to a scrub and steam. And then you try and attune, even if it means a little bit of forcing to the local time zone. Otherwise, you're off kilter for just too long. That didn't stop me from being awake, wide awake at 3 a.m. and going over to the Krishna temple and doing the morning arti, the morning fire ceremony and chant at 4:30, and then getting on a Lime bike and driving all over London when there's almost no traffic, very few people on the streets, just as the sun's coming up, and getting to see all of those sights without the crowds or the noise. Pretty beautiful. So we are totally blessed today to have Yasmeen Turayhi on as a guest. She is not only a technology agency founder, a startup founder, and a filmmaker, and a 3-time author, a speaker, and a podcast host of 3 different shows, both a dramatization called A Star in the Desert, and then one called Gateways to Awakening, which is now in the top 2% of all pods listened to globally on Apple. In addition to all of her highly generative professional work, she is also the holder of a master's certification in intuition medicine and a Kundalini yoga instructor. And we're going to talk a little bit today about the nature of reality and what it means to be the mistress of one's own being, so that you can walk in the world fully yourself. And she seems to be very, very good at that. There are a lot of lessons in the conversation on everything from honing your thoughts and pruning your energy and allowing things to change, to updating your friendships and your relationships in a way that allows you to really be in full emergence and offer all of your gifts to the world. So before we get into the interview, I'd like to talk a little bit about the invisible world. Can you trust the invisible? I've been talking a lot more on the show about things that are not seeable in our experience. We've been talking about intuition, energy hygiene, frequency, manifestation. And it's a curiosity to me how I went from being a material realist, concrete, making art, making babies, growing gardens, and all of that stuff, to dealing in the unseen, in what I would call the spiritual or the space in between, learning about quantum physics, really principles like quantum entanglement, all that Einstein and Heisenberg and all of that stuff, which, by the way, even though it's weird and not visible or not concrete, it's also the technology that's the basis for everything from MRI machines to semiconductors, radio waves and microwaves and X-rays, which are all crucial in communication and medicine and astronomy. Invisible sound waves coming through the air that are showing up and helping you listen to this podcast right now, particularly if it's on Wi-Fi. So, we have consistent application of electromagnetic principles that reinforce our trust in those kind of invisible forces. You have gravity and dark matter. And then you have things like the intangibles, like the power of love, this quintessentially human experience as an invisible force which profoundly impacts every day of our lives. Who we love, how it motivates us, how it animates us. You could try to break that down into neuroscience and hormones and chemical reactions, but it's just so much more. And the same is true with faith and belief and intuition and gut feelings. And I think in part the reason the invisible world spooks out a lot of people who are material realists still is that it is utterly not controllable in the ways that we want to control things. It sort of leaves us in the hands of these vibrational and frequency realities. And I think that as we become more familiar with the language of the invisible world and more attuned to our own natural ability to perceive, connect with, trust, and work with invisible forces, that we remember our ancient capacity as both transmitter and receiver in a way that makes our world better. So with that as an intro, I'd love to get into this conversation with Yasmeen. The desire of the world seems to be to pigeonhole you into, I'm a product marketer, I'm a podcaster, I'm a mother, but everybody's lives are hyphenated. You even had a program on growing up as a hyphenated being. What does that mean to you, to be hyphenated?
Yeah, I think that the external world likes to categorize and make sense of things. And so by labeling it, I think it helps people connect with an understanding of someone. And I think that human beings are so much more dynamic and complex and nuanced. And it actually prevents us when we get labeled in one, category to really expand into our full selves and to also give ourselves permission to not be the same version of ourselves that we were even yesterday. I think so many people assume that because they've been someone for so long that they have to continue to be that same person. So I never really played with that consensus reality or expectation of me. And so, yeah, let's see, where do we begin with this question?
I mean, even just on that idea alone of like allowing yourself to be a complex being, that's very fine in a community where you have that depth and dimension. And where I see people getting stuck is when they built their commercial reality around, oh, you're the anti-aging guy, or, you're the sexpert. And then it's hard to break out because you've built your entire economic reality around that. But as an individual, it feels like the only way to live is to be Renaissance everything.
Right. Yeah. I think, so someone had said that to me at one point in my career. She was like, Yasmeen, you're doing so many things and it's going to come across confusing to people, right? But like my job is not necessarily to identify with one economic reality. My job is to be my full authentic self. And I will say, I think for some people, maybe setting in motion one kind of career for a period of time just to become excellent at it does make sense, right? So for product marketing, I've been doing it for 15 years. I've gone deep in it. I've written books on it. I've worked with probably 50 startups plus. And so I feel very confident in my ability to commercialize products and specifically software products. And, but that skill set is so powerful to leverage into other different careers and areas and interests. And I think that's the sort of exciting part of life is to take your skill sets and to use them in other areas, that you find interesting. And so I tend to just follow my excitement, my passion, as opposed to following what society expects of me or what people think is the assembly line kind of life. And in some cases, it's I've found defeat. In other cases, it's been extraordinarily rewarding. And so I'm not afraid to take that risk. I think a lot of people might be afraid to take a little bit of risk out of the consensus.
I love what you're saying, and particularly the product marketing base, because then you can effectively take these inspirational components and treat them as products that you're launching. And they're not like your identity is being launched. It's that these individual discrete components are productized in some way. And I mean, that feels resonant.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. And like what you said is so powerful. The identity of self with, a specific company or career or even position, I think limits people, right? And so I'm in service of helping people launch really powerful, excellent products, but I don't identify myself with what necessarily happens all the time. And so I think there's like a distinction where I find myself, the way I even visualize it is I'm on my own island and all these products are on their own island. All these companies are on their own island. All my projects are on their own island, and I'm a separate island, but at the same time, these islands can send energy. There's like a two-way street of energy we're sending back and forth to each other. So it's interdependent, but it's not dependent.
Oh, it's like soul protective.
Yes. You
don't get like colonized by one project or something and then lose this depth and richness inside.
Right. Because I think when we associate the project or the company with ourselves, we sort of become dependent on them. And then there's a scarcity mentality associated with like, this is the one thing that's going to bring me money. This is the one thing that's going to bring me respect. But the reality is it's the universal flow of energy that is bringing us that is finding the people, the players, the companies, the brands, and we just have to show up to it. So I'm not overly dependent on one type of reality because I know that the moment one door closes, so many others open. And, there might be an uncomfortable period of uncertainty, but there's just infinite possibilities. And I that alone, I think, drives me crazy when it comes to connecting with the collective, because I think the mainstream perspective is like, no, there's just a narrow band of reality available to each of us. And if we don't get on this one lane of success, then there's no other option. But that's just a program. I don't feel like that's a program that's serving us.
Yeah, you've already invited in this large conversation on trusting, on seeing possibility, and then as you just put it, tapping into the universal energy flow. Do you think that idea has been with you in some form for much of your life, or have you evolved into that?
Oh, definitely not. I feel like I was working against myself for a good part of my life. I was like, did not understand energy. I think that life is a game. I think that most people don't know it's a game. And even if they know it's a game, they don't know the rules of the game. That's been my experience over the last, I'd say, decade, is understanding the rules of the game and experimenting with those rules. And when I was growing up, I mean, I had no access to things like yoga or meditation or spirituality. I grew up as a Muslim American, then went to Catholic school, and then became more or less an agnostic for a good portion of my 20s. And then just had a huge course correct when I entered my 30s, when I moved to the Bay Area. I found out that I was clairaudient, and as an agnostic, that really blew my mind because I didn't quite understand what was happening. I really actually thought that I was losing my mind, essentially. And now that I've been studying this for 10 years, what's interesting about consciousness is the sort of two camps that I think people identify with is consciousness local or is it non-local? And because I had the experience of clairaudience, I was forced to believe that consciousness is non-local. Because I was like, how is it possible that I could access information in different time, space, dimension? than the present moment. And that really just completely blew my mind. And as a logical, analytical person, I spent many years trying to figure that out. And I feel like I got to an understanding of how energy maps to our experience of living through these principles.
Yeah, we're gonna definitely come back to that. Let's talk about, because I just want to capture this thought before it evades me. I have begun to think of the mind in the sort of local consciousness as sort of the controller of the body. It's like a satellite consciousness that helps manage the local experience of just this body, keeps the heart beating, doing all those things, but that it's also connected to this larger consciousness store, and that it's when you confuse the local consciousness for the whole thing that things get egoic and messy. Not that the ego is a bad thing. That's a whole other conversation. But, just to acknowledge that it's pervasive somehow.
Yeah, I love that. No, I love that so much. I mean, I think, yeah, it's an interesting thing. It's, because if you think about non-local consciousness, we're tapping into this universal field, but we actually are also part of this universal field. So we're never actually really separate from it. So it's like it's an interesting kind of visualization. And I agree with you about the ego piece. I've had about 200 guests on my show. So I interviewed a lot of people in the world of consciousness. And it's interesting because like when I hear their sound current, their frequency, sometimes it's not in alignment with their sound current when I interview them, and their energy seems very different. And I always wondered, like, why is it that some people's energy feels so different? And the sort of game with energy is, as we elevate or as we have agency over our own energy, we're tested, right? Because we oftentimes will have influence, power, money, people who are interested in our work. And then that's precisely the moment, I think, where we get tested in terms of getting out of that flow of energy, the universal flow. Like when someone gives you a compliment. So, when someone says, oh my gosh, you're so good at this thing, when I've been performing really well in, let's say, a sport, all of a sudden now my ego is like, oh yeah, I am really good at this thing. And then I'm actually disconnected from the flow. And so my job is to constantly go back to the flow and sort of ignore a lot of both praise and criticism, right? Because I think the game in energy is also not to be in a hierarchy, either have a perception of ourselves as better or worse. Actually, both of those things are just as bad,
Same frequency.
Yes, and frequent. Yep, exactly. It was sort of also occurred to me that two particles, this is the way that I see it in an energy space, which is two particles can't be in the same time space dimension if there is a hierarchy. If I think that this thing is more important than me, or I'm more important than it, then we actually are not going to be in the same space for long.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love this. I love this so much. So here you are. Let's go back and tell a little backstory.
Okay.
So I saw that you did write and document a lot more about your upbringing in a 10 episode series about being Iraqi American. And I wonder if you could just drop into that a little bit and maybe mention your dad. I know you just spent time with him on the Camino, and it seems like you're very close. And I'm curious about how that relationship and that story and immigration and all of that stuff formed you.
Yeah, thanks for asking. Yeah, it's interesting. My journey has been, it feels like I've lived like 50 lifetimes. So, going back to my childhood, I sometimes have to really sit and think about the version of my childhood that I remember as I'm sort of updating. So let me explain. When I wrote Hyphenated Journey, I felt a certain way about my upbringing and childhood and being a third gen kid. Years later now, I actually feel quite different. So it's interesting, like the past, in my opinion, is not fixed. Our memories of the past are oftentimes based on our perception of the present in relationship to the past. So when I was growing up, grew up in Chicago, my parents are both from Iraq. And for those of you maybe who are listening and were born a little bit later than me, 1991 was actually the beginning of the first Gulf War in Iraq. And so it was really interesting to witness the polarity, like the duality of two countries going to war with each other while I was a citizen of one that was on the offensive. that experience, because I think a lot of people, will have immigrant stories or stories of war, but to live in a country and be born in a country and witness that your country is destroying the country of your parents, and there's a very active participation from, the mainstream through military partaking in that, right? Because there's a lot of people who spoke about going to Iraq and what they experienced in Iraq in the U.S. Well, I felt like I was being robbed of my experience of connecting with my family and friends in the region for most of my childhood. So it was fascinating. It was interesting. And I think I had a front row seat to the game of duality. And then I went to New York for college. I actually started college in New York the month of 9/11. Yeah, subsequently, 2 years later, the second Gulf War happened. So it was kind of like this re-traumatization that I experienced in college. But, there was a moment where I was very much an activist, a very anti-war activist. And I started to realize, I would say, through doing a lot of this work and energy, that participating in the game of duality actually creates more duality. It creates more polarity. My side is better than your side is better than mine. And so it just became this conversation that felt like it was not in service of me offering something generative to the collective. So that's why I say, as much as that is my story and was my story, I don't like to identify with it anymore. Like, I certainly don't feel like a victim. I certainly feel like I have so much agency over my own life, and it's my perspective. And I feel like I was given like I said, a front row seat to duality on purpose to understand the larger game of duality on the planet and in the cosmos. So, and just to speak a little bit about my relationship with my father, it's that I feel like I need to do a whole other podcast episode on this, because we just walked the Camino de Santiago, 122 kilometers. And my dad's kind of like the Iraqi Larry David. He is just an absolute riot, very sarcastic, and I said to him, I want you to walk this with me. It'd be so great to spend some time together and really drop in. We hadn't had like one-on-one uninterrupted time like this in, I think, all my life. I mean, who has that kind of uninterrupted time all day, all night, walking, spending so much time together with one parent? Usually that's, it's both parents, or there's a couple days that we spend with a parent. But to do that, it was super intensive. And I will say, coming out of it, I felt like I have never experienced this level of connection with my dad. And I'm so grateful. Like, I feel like I saw him, and I feel like he saw me. And, and I think it was hard for both my parents to have to raise, American kids with ideologies of a culture that was actually eroding in its own way. So it was an interesting thing where the 1970s of Iraq was forever gone, but in their mind it was time-stamped in the way that, culture and family and relationships should play out. And so it was really hard, I think, for me to experience the nuance, the difference between their expectation of life and then what I was sort of seeing as a complete 180 in my own reality. And so at some point, a lot of people who are children of immigrants say that they oftentimes felt like they lived double lives growing up. And that was very much the case for me. I'd spent all my time with my Iraqi American family and Middle Eastern people, and, even just the way we have friendships. It's so different than the way I would form friendships with, let's say, Americans. The word love in Arabic, there's 100 ways to say the word love, right? So there's emotional states that we experience in the Middle East or in Arabic that I couldn't explain to my American friends. And then likewise, like in terms of innovation, culture, independent thinking, a sense of self-realization, self-actualization, agency, a lot of these liberties, especially with freedom of speech, were so the predominant zeitgeist in America. And so it was awkward, right? Because I was like, well, who cares what people think? Who cares what the culture thinks? Like, I want to be self-actualized. I want to know myself. I don't necessarily care about, being of service to the tribe. I want to be of service to myself. So those realities really were in a constant state of tension for the majority of my life. And I think it was only maybe in the last 5 to 8 years or so that I felt like I was able to claim a sense of agency while still holding this beautiful love for tribe and community, and seeing the magic in kind of both of those worlds, and actually blending them and alchemizing them together.
Yeah, there's a body of work in Thomas Hubel's collective trauma stuff that we work on, which is immigration trauma. And you sort of look at like when the immigrant generation leaves their country of origin, they leave all kinds of things like respect and status and familiarity and all of that behind. And there's a certain amount of grief that gets locked into the body, even things like as simple as the flowers that grow in your garden and their scent. And then there's a double whammy when your children are alienated because they're in a different space, and that alienation can be transmitted. And what I hear as you're speaking is this microcosm, macrocosm of the, and I love how you've made meaning out of it and how you've integrated it now. But I can imagine that as a young person, there's a piece of your internal American that's at war with your internal Iraqi, and that there's a deeper knowing of the beauty of the culture, but also in this moment, which side do you sit on? And I feel, as I'm listening to you, the beauty of coming around and walking slowly with the parts of your family and yourself. It's beautiful to see how you're walking with your father and having these rich dialogues at this stage with forgiveness and integration and acceptance.
I think also maybe, and this is maybe not even just a children of immigrant comment, but I think in general, children think that their parents should have the same level of intimacy, that they have with themselves. And I think when I was on the Camino, I was like really documenting a lot of our conversations, and my dad has so many rich stories. And then when I asked him like, well, what about your inner world? He was like, well, I don't know what you mean by that. What does it mean to have an inner world? But the language that I was using wasn't landing, right? But as in the moments, like in the in-between moments, waiting for our bags or sitting down and having lunch after walking, I got to experience his inner world. It was only when I suspended my own maybe judgment or expectation of what I wanted that we were able to really get to a place of deep intimacy. And so I think that was sort of my work, right? In terms of, because someone once said to me, like, whose responsibility is it when it comes to understanding or even misunderstanding? And this response really resonated with me. It was like, it's always the person who's had more privilege in terms of experience to take the responsibility for understanding.
Oh,
yeah.
Beautiful. Someone told me that when you look at nature and the hierarchy of predators and mammals, that the higher up you are in the food chain, the more responsibility you have to the ecosystem. Similarly, this thread of waking up and taking ownership and taking responsibility and seeing the bigger picture. How did you get from being product marketer to going to intuition school and doing a podcast on awakening?
Yeah, that was quite the bridge. So gosh, I think it was maybe 8-9 years ago now. I started to find out that I was clairaudient. I actually had quite a big experience on the Big Island of Hawaii, which sort of set off a chain of events for me, because I met this lawyer. I want to remember her name. I think her name was Rachel. And we were both at this place called Kalani for this week-long retreat. And at the time, I had actually just gone through a breakup and wasn't able to sleep really well. And I didn't want to take any prescription medicine. So a couple months before that, a friend had said to me, well, why don't you try this thing called Reiki? And I was like, no, I'm not going to try anything called Reiki. What is, I was such a non-believer in this space, if you could believe that. But I was kind of at my wit's end. And so she said it again. And I said, you know what do I have to lose? And so I ended up going, and I felt something that I hadn't felt in a long time, which was this sort of connection to that field. And I really actually thought I was sort of making it up, but I was like, okay, I'm going to go through Reiki 1, Reiki 2 training, and did that in San Francisco, then decided to go to Hawaii on this hedonistic kind of return to self-love retreat by this Hawaiian shaman. Now it was a non-plant medicine experience. It was totally, a sober experience. And I met this woman named Rachel, who is a lawyer, and she said to me, you know, if you pray to the island god of Pele, she'll grant you your wishes. And I was like, Rachel, I haven't prayed in over 10 years. I'm not going to start praying right now, especially to an island god. And, you know, she said to me, well, what do you have to lose? And I kind of acknowledged that. I was like, oh, yeah, what do I have to lose? So the next day I would go for these like really long runs. At the time, I was using these dangly headsets. So I was listening to music, going for these long runs, and it was pitch black outside because of the time difference. I was waking up extraordinarily early. So we're sort of off the beaten path, and I go to the, you know, water, and I start praying for the first time in like 10 years. I'm like, okay, tell me what I don't know. Tell me what I'm meant to do with my life. I feel like I need help. Like I really need help. And I was genuine about it. And so that happened. And then I think like maybe an hour later, 30 minutes later, I'm going for the run again. And I hear this voice. And I'm now, you know, I'm on the right side of the street, and I hear this voice, and it says, take 2 steps to the left. And I think, and as I'm, the important sort of detail here is that I'm listening to music. So it was very awkward. I heard the voice and I just did it. So I took 2 steps to the left, and now I'm in the middle of the street with the yellow lines. And all of a sudden, as I'm walking these yellow lines, still listening to music, a huge semi-truck turns out of nowhere on my left-hand side, turns left. So the wind of the truck literally graced my right shoulder, like by a millimeter. So I would have immediately died if I had not moved 2 steps to the left. And so the person driving was this older lady. She saw me in the rearview mirror. She got out and she was like, oh my God, you were dressed in all black. I would have driven right through you. And that was the first moment where I was like, what the heck just happened? Like I couldn't logically explain that. It wasn't like I had a feeling to take 2 steps to the left. I heard something, and I knew that it was otherworldly. Like it wasn't me. It wasn't my thoughts. And then when I was open to it, a lot of information started to come through. And then I found this intuition program kind of at the right time, about maybe 9 months later. And that was really foundational for me because we were taught 15 different, you know, energy systems. It's hard to explain this without using different language, but essentially different energy systems to manage energy in the body. So sort of like a blend between Chinese medicine and Ayurveda and Western homeopathy. And so it was a blend of all these worlds and so much more. It really changed my life. I mean, it was 2 years. I will say I needed a lot more after that still. Like I studied a lot of different modalities after that, but it was an incredible foundation for me to understand intuition. And when you're practicing it every day, you can get really good at it, right? It's kind of like a skill set. So I was doing deep, like multi-hour meditations every single day it was about a 2-year program. And then that catapulted me into making my first short film, the podcast. So like all the things started to come to me. That's a very important distinction. I never went looking for any of these things. I set an intention. I said I would love to have a podcast on consciousness, and then I left it alone. I wanted to write a book on product marketing, and then I left it alone. All those things started to happen right after my intuition program. So I found the editor for my book found me. My business partner for the short film that I wrote, I met him at a birthday party, and he convinced me to make my own movie. The podcast found me. I got introduced to them. That's a whole other wild story I won't go into, but they actually, Hakawati, which owns the production of the podcast, they have 9 other podcasts. They asked me for 6 months to do the show, and I actually said no for a while. And so that was really different than the first sort of half of my life, if you will, or more, of sort of just finding things and doing things by sheer will. You know, I was like, I'm going to work hard. I'm going to do it in a linear model, where all of a sudden it was like, once I got my energy into coherence and alignment, everything I wanted found me.
Yeah. And I'm also like, I just felt like the difference of the first person experience of that. Like, how did it feel in your body before to do all this stuff? And how did it feel in your body after? Like, I watched you finish this last short up at that retreat, and you were busy, but there was no sense of like that smell that people off gas of anxiety and desperation when they're on a deadline. Like you can smell it on people's bodies. You had none of that. You're just busy and trying to get it done. And so can you speak a little bit to the experience of the will being in charge and the experience of energy being in charge?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. That's such a great question. And thank you for noticing that. That's really cool that you picked up on that nuance. Because, for so much of my life, especially, so I worked in New York City. I was doing mergers and acquisitions. I was working in energy. I went to business school, part-time while working full-time. So I definitely swam in the sea of anxiety. And I was a person who definitely did not have a regulated nervous system for definitely, my younger years and then my 20s for sure. And I would cope through other things, other ways. And so in this, I would say 8-year process, it's been a slow evolution of chipping away at all the ways my emotions, my feelings, my thoughts have not served me. So let me actually back up and say at a macro level, I believe that life is a game. I'm not attached to the game that I'm playing. I'm actually not attached to this world at all. And I will go to zero on anything, anyone at any time, because my life is just, it feels like it's this dream that I'm in, and it doesn't feel, and it's true. I mean, we're all going to die one day. We're all not going to be here. And people get so caught up in the dream. They get so caught up in the film of their own reality that they forget who they really are, which is this infinite soul, spirit, energy, whatever you want to call it, that is not going to leave just after we die, right? Like our energy will go on to some other space-time dimension. I always jokingly say, like, in 500 years, wouldn't you rather be a person who's evolving your energy than a person who's just amassing all this wealth and sacrificing your happiness in this one lifetime as a result of it, for example, right? Like, I think that that teaching is just not done. And so I think that was my experience. It's like, I'm not attached either way. If we win, if we don't win, the journey is so much more fun. So that's my approach to kind of everything in life. Like, okay, if something leaves, that just means it wasn't meant for me. I'm not going to create a story or create meaning around it that doesn't serve me. And I will say the last 3 years, I've been very diligent about observing every thought that I have. I probably spend several hours a day honing my thoughts and ensuring the reality that I want to be a part of. So it's really ignoring a lot of information, fear-based information, or information that is not in service of where I want to go. But that's sort of the way that I see reality is like we're all watching our own film, and based on our thoughts, our energy, our frequency, let's say it's like a radio dial, right? The radio dial could be playing at one station or a lower station based on our belief. Like there's always...
Yeah. What are you catching? What channel are you picking up on?
Exactly. It's like we have these theories on reality, all of us, right? We have a specific theory, and based on our theory, based on our identity, we're always going to find evidence to support our identity and support our theory. So if I don't like what I'm seeing, it means that the theory or the identity that I have about myself is not serving me. And so I became a student of my thoughts and a student of my energy. So the moment my external world does not show up in ways that I'm, let's say, in alignment with, I don't go to the outside world to change it. I go back to my inner world.
When you say go to zero, what do you mean by that?
I'm just willing to sort of detach myself from any version that is no longer serving me. It's when our frequency changes, the reality of our external reality changes. And as a result, we might need to leave people behind. We might need to leave situations behind that are not serving us. In some cases, the reality that we leave behind catches up, right? We become an inspiration, and there's a catch-up effect. And in some cases, people don't want to change. And so I'm not interested in forcing people to change. Everyone's on their own journey. We all have a default energy space and state. I'm just really focused on being a tuning fork for the collective. And I can't do that if I get stuck in places that are not generative.
I'm interested in a little bit in how that affects, like, I have a couple of people in my life, for example, and I love them dearly. And they are also like stuck, 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 and have been stuck in the same stories for years. But there's a part of my narrative about being loyal and holding space. Yeah, I just don't detach. I just like hold them. And then I feel that I've these open soul contracts that are like clouding my energy field. And this is a core question that I dance with between doing what's right for me or the bigger mission that I'm called to and living into community, family connection.
Yeah. This dance, I think, is the hardest dance to reconcile in this space, right? When you're doing your inner work, the frequency that we emit, let's say we all have our own smell, we have our frequency. And by the way, it's not so much about elevating high frequencies. In some cases, we want to have a frequency that might be maybe more prideful, for example, to get something done. So I'm not saying that having these high energy states or feeling states or emotional states is necessarily always in service of someone's path. Like in some cases, we might need lower energy states to even feel the desire to get something done, right?
Yeah, I think of it as like authentic, like, are you being authentic and true? And are you not operating from fear? Those are the sort of two things that feel to me. It's not like, wherever you are on that continuum of the frequency of love and all that stuff. That's beautiful. But it's like, how much are you operating from, as we began, possibility thinking and what is authentic and true for you?
100%. Yes, exactly. Yeah, it's not being like, bypassing, or that's also a question that comes up a lot. People are like, isn't this just spiritual bypass? And it's like, no, it's feeling the feelings, being like dropping into your heart and then experiencing what it is that you want to experience, as opposed to just exclusively responding and reacting to your life.
That's real freedom.
That's real freedom, right? It's like, I'm going to choose this. This is what my external reality is showing me, but I'm going to choose the higher option. And these micro choices really do make an impact. Now, you asked this question about relationships. So that it's an interesting area that I think for me, I'm still experimenting with, because when our frequencies shift, what happens is it actually becomes uncomfortable for that person and also uncomfortable for us when our frequency, our energy is not close enough. Like the band might be, or the range might be too high or too extreme. So it actually just becomes uncomfortable energetically for both parties. So that's why it's like, actually, it's nobody's fault when people say, oh, I don't like this person's vibe. It's not that. It's just that there's actually disharmony with our frequencies.
Yeah, dissonance.
There's dissonance and there's not coherence, right? And what happens is we usually become the average of the two frequencies. So over time, one person can either go down, the other person can either go up, or there's a shift, right? There's a shift and there's a blend. I think in some cases, if the range is too extreme, it's just not going to be comfortable for both parties over time. If someone wants to, let's say, play the victim, and that's their story, that's their identity, that's who they want to be, and another person is like, well, I know that I'm my own creator and I could do all these things, like there's just going to be disharmony. So that's okay. I think leaving people alone is what I've come to believe. It's like, we can't change people. We can only focus on ourselves, and people will either catch up or they won't. And so I don't think that there's that much that we can do when it comes to relationships. I think I've decided, and this is just my decision, I'm not saying it's the right decision, but I've sort of decided that there's a delicate balance. Like there's certain people in my life, like family, for instance, it doesn't matter where they're at, I'm always going to be there for them because that's really meaningful for me. But when it comes to certain friendships that are outdated, I have always been so surprised at the new people I meet every year and how much more in alignment that newer friendships can even be for me than 20-year friendships, right? So yeah, I don't have a great answer for that question. Let's put it that way.
I actually love that answer. And I think that I've never really heard it. What I love about this dissonance or disharmony, the frequencies being off, is that it doesn't have any blame. There's no blame. There's no make wrong. There's no judgment, which has been like my entire intention for this year. It's like, just step out of that frame that it's wrong. It's perfect. It's just not a fit. That's totally different idea. So you mentioned a couple of things. One is monitoring and being present to your own thoughts. And I'm wondering if you have other tips for cultivating and expanding the energy body. Sort of what do you do now that you've been in it for a decade? What suggestions can you make?
Yeah, so I am both a student and a teacher of Kundalini Yoga. So that's been really instrumental for me. I don't recommend it for everyone because, it's a modality that brings energy into the upper chakras. So if people are, let's say, disassociated or not very grounded people, then it might not work for them, right? So I would say the very first thing that one should do is to get really grounded, really present and grounded in their own body, have their energy in their own physical space, as opposed to kind of being fragmented and disassociated. I think most people that I've witnessed are not actually embodied. They're not comfortable in their body. They don't have a relationship with their body. They don't have a relationship with the earth. I think cultivating that feels like the first principle. It's like, put your feet on the ground, do a grounding meditation in terms of dropping your energy down to the center of the earth. Surround yourself with people who are also grounded, right? Because that can help you entrain to that feeling of grounding energy. There's a lot of different practices too, with listening to grounding music, the Schumann resonance, which is like a very powerful resonance. Yeah, so I would start there. And then with Kundalini Yoga, that's been really game-changing for me because it uses a lot of the body's technology and the world of energy to activate the field around them. And there's like the 10 bodies in yoga. And so I love working with like the subtle body, for example. And for those of us who I think are very sensitive to energy, we can feel that. We can sort of grok the world around someone, the snowball in which someone lives in. And so my desire really is to show up as the most embodied, relaxed, expansive person in a room. Really, just to show up relaxed, I think is such a gift to other people with a relaxed nervous system. So yeah, so grounding, and we found in our intuition program that a lot of people's sort of disease and disharmony comes from a lack of being grounded in the body. So even a simple exercise of 5 minutes of grounding a day could be game changing. And it also helps with your orientation around time. Because if we're not grounded, then our energy is so fragmented, so it takes us much longer to get something done. So for me, when I'm working on a project or doing any kind of work, I always focus on grounding first before even pulling in information from the field or connecting with the field, because that's really, we can't actually move energy up if we're not embodied.
I love that so much. And in the practices that I train in and teach in, you imagine sort of the inverse of your height as the root structure. And then that from that place, grounding even deeper into the core of the earth, and then from your crown up an equal way and out from the body in all directions. Like your energy body isn't just a vertical connection, but it's also like you're tapping into what's in front of you and around you and kind of sending out grounding cords that way.
Yes, definitely. Yeah.
So I'm loving this idea. And by the way, if you're not familiar with clairaudience, I think that there's multiple ways that people get messages. And so you can look up clairvoyance where you're seeing something. You can look up, I think there's one around smell, clairsentience where you just know, and that there are multiple ways of knowing. And that we did an episode, I want to say with Kathy Joy and someone else also on like trusting your intuition and trusting these things that have been so distanced from our scientific mind, that somehow you're not a multidimensional receiver, that you can't be a multidimensional receiver when in fact you're wired for that kind of receptivity. So I'll put some links in where you can learn more about clair anything. And then in this particular example, what I was so fascinated by when you shared the film link was here you'd done a fantasy story of a young boy growing up in Iraq. You're doing the things on product marketing. You're doing the pieces on awakening in the podcast, and they're all so solid and good. Then it seems like it's coming out of left field that all of a sudden there's this award-winning short film on Julian Assange. And so I'm wondering how these practices, did that just appear to you, and what drew you to that topic?
So the context for this short film, it's called the Collaboration Filmmakers Challenge. So it happens every year. It was a 2-week competition, and the prompt that they gave us was a Hunter S. Thompson quote. And the quote was, "Freedom is something that dies if it isn't used." That was all they gave us. And they're like, go nuts, have fun. And to be honest, I mean, I actually written a couple shorts about growing, another kind of trope on growing up Iraqi American or during the pandemic, what it was like to lose freedom, and just so many different ideas I was brainstorming with this team of mine. And then it just came to me. I was like, freedom of speech. I mean, this is sort of the major theme that I think we're going to be looking at this year, especially. So much is at stake with what is true freedom of speech. And so that just dropped into my consciousness. And I just had this feeling. I was like, well, I met Julian Assange's brother through a friend, and he had been on my podcast 2 months prior. And so I thought to myself, well, how cool would it be to do a documentary and to have him as kind of like the main character, and let me see if he can do it. So that was sort of the genesis story for making a film about Julian Assange, because it does feel like it came out of left field. Like I said before, I'm not really playing the activist role, but it was sort of a mix of the prompt of the challenge and then also seeing that opportunity. Now, I will say, I have evidence of this. I told Gabriel, who's Julian Assange's brother, 2 months ago, I guess was when we had our podcast interview. Maybe it was 3 months ago. And I said, I see him going free or getting out of jail. I see him waving, and I think it's gonna all work out. And he was very skeptical. I frankly, I didn't think it was gonna happen that fast, but I also felt like it was gonna become a bigger case as we got closer to the election for a variety of reasons, right? Because I think he was also worried that if he was extradited to the U.S., that if Trump got elected, that they might use the death penalty, because during the time of Trump, the head of the CIA, there was some talk about having or trying to actually kill him.
Assassinate. I saw that in the film, that Mike Pompeo and the talking heads were sort of saying that. I mean, I find that so crazy in this day and age that you would even talk about killing or assassinating someone for their political activism and views.
And I think what was really interesting about Julian's case is that he was a media publisher, not, a CIA agent. He was simply a publisher. So I think that it set a really terrible standard. It's still, I will say, even though he got out, I don't know the terms of the deal that was negotiated, but the precedent that's been set has been pretty bad. If you talk poorly if you publish things that are not in service of the U.S. government, then you're sort of, you can end up in prison forever and have your life kind of messed up. So the stakes are pretty high. And I think a lot of journalists are not going to take that risk going forward. So
it'd be so interesting to hear what he's made of the time in prison. Like, what has he learned? Who has he become? The questions that he was asking before he was publishing information, like, will it save lives? Do you really know what's going on? What is your government really doing? That there's a sort of a transparency and accountability. Like, I can't be accountable to who I elect if I don't know what they're doing.
Right.
And so there's something really beautiful in what he was offering. And this also flies into this question of, like, do you want to know in your life? Like, to have a clean energy body, there's a question of, like, it's transparent. I see what's going on. I'm being agentic in my choices. I don't have my head under the sand going la, 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 la. So he's, those kinds of people seem to me to be more in service of that transparent world.
Right. And I think, every person, place, government, country has a shadow side. Mm-hmm. And what we've sort of said in our reality is that we are not willing or able to talk about our shadow side. And that is a very dangerous place to play in. Like, what does that mean about the U.S. government? So they're never going to take responsibility for committing crimes. Like, that's kind of ridiculous. Like, we don't have to go down that rabbit hole.
I do want to go down just that piece about you listening. Like, I heard, you could have done all of these other answers to that prompt.
Right.
When it says freedom is something that dies if you don't use it, my first idea went to your shoulder joints. Like, oh yeah, if you don't do this, you're going to get calcifications and you won't actually be able to move your body. You could have answered that in so many ways.
Totally.
So as you're looking out in your life now, what do you feel coming? Like, where's your individual direction? Do you have a sense?
Yeah, well, it's become clear that I think storytelling is a passion and a desire of mine to tell stories that are generative, that might awaken people or open minds and perspectives. And so I feel like that's been coming in pretty hard right now. So I'm working on a TV pilot that is kind of a mix between spirituality, Silicon Valley, and what it is to kind of come of age during this time, this intersection of trying to find ourselves on a spiritual path with like AI. So I wrote a TV pilot. I am also going to probably work on a podcast miniseries about the Camino with my father, and working on another short film. So as part of the win of that short film competition of For We the People, the case for Julian Assange, I actually got a development deal to work on another film. So yeah, so there's a lot of exciting like storytelling projects. I'm still doing a lot of climate tech, neurotech, fintech, working with tech startups in that world. And then I have my intuition school. So I help executives. I have a 5-week program and a 3-month program. And it's also beyond intuition. It's really about managing energy. It's like everything that I've learned. And my desire is to just teach people these principles so that they can teach others, like to become their own teachers. But yeah, so that's kind of the next couple months. We'll see. But I'm always like so surprised about what happens in a year. You know, if you really play with this space, a lot can happen.
I am also. Sometimes it's, even if it looks similar on the outside, it's utterly changed from the firsthand experience. So I hope everyone who's listened has been inspired to dive deeper into their own receptive organ of beingness, to pull down what wants to be born through them, to listen for this quality of being in the body, of lowering your resistance to the message, and then acting on it. This is sort of the meta story that I'm feeling, is that if you're really listening and you're not acting in fear, then anything's possible.
Amen. I love that.
And find you. So are you doing classes? Are you coaching one-on-one? What is this intuition school?
Yeah. So the school is called innerknowingschool.com. So you can just navigate to that online. I predominantly work with people one-on-one, but I do offer a group about twice a year. I'm really passionate about helping people on this topic. And so beyond just the podcast, this gives people more practical tools and applications as opposed to more theory and insight.
Beautiful. I didn't know we were going to talk about these things today. And yesterday, my post on my Substack was called The Holy, Holy Body. And it opens with the story at Kalani and it ends with grounding in the earth. So I feel like even that is like our little intuition frequency.
Oh my gosh, that's amazing. I can't wait to read it. That's so special.
Thank you so much, Yasmeen. I'm taking some things away from this conversation on the meta level. One is how to be all of yourself, to allow your interests and your intuition to pull you into greater and greater possibility. Some very practical techniques for grounding, for clearing my energy, for listening to my intuition. Thank you for that. I'm also taking into account that you don't have to be pigeonholed. You can move from the esoteric to the political in one seamless gesture. You can move from being one identity to another in one seamless, non-discordant, beautiful, elegant move. One gesture. I also am reminded to take the time to go for a long, multi-day walk with the people I love the most before the chance is gone. I want to weave back in something she said early in the conversation about there being 100 words for love in Arabic, and encourage you to tune in to all of the different flavors of love that you're carrying in your life today, that you carry in your life this week. And if you need some inspiration on that, here's a shameless plug for the work of Jarrett Sleeper. There's a particular poem he does called 30 Words for Love, which are all neologisms, but they describe some flavors of love that we all deeply can connect with and resonate with. Please take a few moments and support the work of Rosebud Woman, rosewoman.com, the best in intimate care and body care products you will find out there, and Radiant Farms, exquisite herbal plant medicines that are legal and help with the common ailments of being in a human body. radiantfarms.us. And as always, you can find me online at the.rose.woman on Instagram. Okay, be well. All love.